Hi, my name is Jeff Sivens. I'm senior counsel at Haynes and Boone. For the past 45 years, I've been an environmental law practitioner, and for the past 30, I've been an adjunct professor at the University of Texas School of Law. I'm appearing today in my role as chair of the EarthxLaw Advisory Council. And our program today will focus on the United States Environmental Protection Agency, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary. And today we're going to talk about what EPA has accomplished, what it might accomplish, and how else we might further the objectives of the EPA to protect human health and the environment. To discuss this topic, there's no better person than today's guest. It's my pleasure and privilege to welcome William K. Riley. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. Very happy to be here.
And we're particularly fortunate to have you here. Bill served as EPA administrator under George H.W. Bush from 1989 to 1993. And we're excited to have him not only because of what EPA accomplished then, which includes the Clean Air Act Amendment of 1990, the last major piece of federal legislation in the environmental arena, except for the Toxic Substances Control Act recently, but also because of his experience. Bill served under 4 presidents, 2 Republican and 2 Democrat, and he also worked with NGOs and with industry and in academia. These experiences make Bill's perspective all the more insightful and make this conversation all the more illuminating. I'll tell you a little bit about Bill. He graduated from Yale, got his law degree from Harvard, then served in the Army as a captain from 1966 to 1967, returned to school at Columbia, where he received a master's in urban planning there. Bill, why don't you pick up your story from there and tell us how you acquired your passion, your interest in the environment and protecting the environment, and how your experience led to your appointment by President Bush as EPA administrator.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that nice introduction too. My father thought that I was overeducated, Jeff, so I've not dwelled on the time I spent in schools. I remember he said to me once, when you're about 40, I think you'll have this down, and you can move beyond education. Well, I think that my interest largely began with visits to a farm, which my father had bought in 1940, and the experience of looking at the hedgerows, which in those days surrounded most Midwestern farms. This was in downstate Illinois. The hedgerows were full of foxes and pheasants and birds of all sorts. And I can remember looking at them. I would climb up in the barn where we stored the corn crib, and just generally see the foxes playing down in the cornfields. Farmer didn't like it particularly because they knocked down some of the corn stalks. But I got a kind of romance about land, honestly. And my father had one about the sea. He had grown up around the sea and started his life on the sea and on the old Fall River line he was 16 years old. He was working on a ship there. And so we would go back every year, and he would take me out to the harbor in Newport, Rhode Island, and just get this wanderlust with the regret that he was in the Middle West, 1,200 miles away from the ocean. I think I put it together, and it was a romance. And I think your emotions always come first, and then you get rational and you learn about things. But I've really traced my roots to those experiences.
So after you left Columbia, picked up your degree in urban planning, what did you do, and what happened next that led you to EPA?
Well, I worked for a law firm in Chicago between the time I graduated from law school and went into the Army. And I worked there. I went there because it was considered one of the most impressive and effective land use counseling firms in the United States. And so when I got out of the Army, it turned out the Nixon administration had been elected. John Ehrlichman was a land use lawyer. He was the principal domestic advisor to President Nixon and an environmentalist. And he turned to my old boss, Richard Babcock, who is a great land use lawyer, an iconic one, known everywhere, for advice. He said, if you were to have a National Land Use Policy Act drafted, who would you get to do it? And Babcock, according to the story I was told, said Riley. Interestingly, Babcock had managed Adlai Stevenson's campaign in Illinois, so the land use fraternity overcame partisanship. And I found myself invited to join the new Council on Environmental Quality as the person to write that land use law. As it turned out, I wrote the Coastal Zone Management Act. And then I did a number of other things while I was there. For 2 years in the Nixon White House, I was the one who wrote the first regulations for environmental impact assessment and then explained them to the various federal agencies. I always had a land use orientation, and that was my focus to begin with, and it still is important to me.
That's interesting. So you were involved in the CQ regs, the National Environmental Policy Act. Can you tell us a little bit? I think it would be useful for the viewers to understand under what circumstances an environmental impact statement might be triggered and how it requires that you consider alternatives, but not necessarily make a decision based on which one you think is the most environmentally protected.
Well, you just covered the key element of it, Jeff. The history of major infrastructure, major projects, which is really what the Congress had in mind when they drafted the law on impact statements, impact assessment. They had always been conceived basically as matters of engineering, cost, effectiveness, efficiency, transportation projects, things of that sort. But notably absent was any systematic consideration of the environmental impact of those projects. And by the time of the first Earth Day, 1970, that was no longer quite acceptable or justifiable. We'd had a number of experiences with rivers catching fire and big oil spill in Santa Barbara, and the country had become different. As someone put it, if you were not a friend of the environment on Earth Day 1970, you kept quiet about it. The country really had transformed itself into one of major impatience, expectation, and I think though some of the protests were negative, car burnings and things of that sort, essentially confidence and hopefulness. And whether it was judges and lawyers, professors, kids, students, there was a genuine sense of, I think, common enterprise. And I remember at the time thinking, what else but the environment could do this? It's a wonderful cause that can bring us all together.
So let's talk about that then. The Environmental Protection Agency was created under 1970 by President Nixon. And you mentioned some of the factors that may have led to the creation of EPA, but can you talk a little bit more about how EPA was created and what the administration hoped to achieve through the creation of EPA?
Well, the extraordinary thing about the creation of EPA and NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, is that the president was responding to a groundswell of interest and finding a way to channel it into an administrative response. He was not personally a committed student or aficionado of the environment, but he had read the mood of the country and was doing something that was not something probably that was close to his heart in the way that foreign policy was. He had seen that the environment was number 3 in the concerns of the public in 1968, after the war in Vietnam and the economy. And he said to his people, get out front on the environment. Well, it soon became clear that the various elements of the government that dealt with aspects of the environment were scattered all over the place. Different agencies, Agriculture Department, Interior Department, Health Department. And he decided to appoint a commission that that was to look into making more efficient the whole environmental enterprise. And they proposed the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency and gave it the authorities of pesticide regulation, which had been in agriculture, water pollution control, which had been in interior, and so forth. That really started it off. There were great expectations for it. And we had the great good fortune to get as the first administrator, Bill Ruckelshaus, a young former legislator in the state legislature, national, or I think majority leader as a very young man, who was then assistant attorney general. He became the administrator and he established the independence, the integrity. And of course, he was famous, the Saturday Night Massacre, when Elliot Richardson and he both resigned rather than take orders to fire Archibald Cox, the special investigator.
Very, very interesting. So EPA was created in 1970 and you joined it as administrator in 1989. What about the first 20 years of EPA? What did the agency accomplish by the time you had gotten there?
Well, I think the significant accomplishment was to establish the history of an independent agency with integrity that was seriously dedicated to the administration of the laws, which was not always easy. In the auto industry, when the Clean Air Act was first proposed, said that this would be the end. They literally said this would be the end of the combustion engine and of the auto industry in the United States. In fact, when I proposed the Clean Air Act amendments in 1989, I remember the chairman of General Motors said to me, "We're not going to make the kind of exaggerated claims we made before. What we're going to say is that what you're proposing is going to add $700 to the cost of the average car." And that was the debate we had. It was a perfectly reasonable one. But the Clean Air Act of 1970 postulated technological advances that were not yet fully proven. The catalytic converter was a good example. But basically, they simply said that the auto industry had to achieve them. And to the great credit of the industry, they did. Well, what we now have is traceable back to those years. We have an automobile fleet that is many times the size as it was in 1970, with just a fraction of the aggregate emissions pollution from those cars. I think it's one of the great achievements of the country and of EPA and frankly of the industrial sector of the automotive industry. The other great achievement of EPA, in my view, in that period was the investment and the construction and effectiveness of wastewater treatment plants. Throughout the 70s and much of the 80s, EPA was dispersing about $2 billion a year to local governments around the country to clean up their water. And the fact that the fish have returned to the Hudson and Lake Erie is not dead, and so many of our bucolic streams and rivers now are clear, at least more than half of them have been restored to the point of fishable and swimmable. As Ruckelshaus famously said in one hearing when he came back the second time as EPA administrator, we can't yet say that all of our waters are fishable and swimmable, but at least we can say they are no longer flammable.
So the way it works then is the federal government sets sort of a floor, and then states need to satisfy that floor, those requirements, but they do have flexibility how they go about achieving that. Is that
that's right. That's right. They have a significant amount of flexibility, and in fact, if you look at the system, the most important elements of it, the innovations, have come from the states. If you look at wetlands regulation and protection, Wisconsin was a pioneer. Waste management, hazardous waste management, New Jersey was in the forefront. Air pollution, it was always California, Southern California, and California required the right to request a waiver from federal approaches, largely because it had the most egregious problem, but also because they had the most aggressive innovation. And I granted 9 waivers to the state of California, even to do some things that we didn't think they could do, such as require that all 10% of all vehicles be electric. Well, in that early date, that was not something that either the market would support nor the manufacturing numbers justified. But we said, go ahead and try. They did, and we and my staff had been corrected. It hadn't worked. But California now has pioneering cap and trade legislation to regulate carbon dioxide. And those experiments teach you something, and often other states watch closely how they're implemented and follow the leaders.
So that's interesting. There had been some controversy regarding the Trump administration and California regulations for cars. And it's interesting that a number of the car manufacturers have been supportive of California and the initiatives that they've developed. My wife and I were watching West Wing last night, replays of West Wing, obviously, and President that particular episode, interestingly, talked about the independence of EPA and whether to what extent the president could impact a report. And in that case, it was to cut out a paragraph on coal and the issues that it presented. And I recall in my law school, early in my law school career, our moot court project was whether President Nixon had the authority to impound funds that were intended for environmental protection. Perhaps you can talk a little bit about when you say that EPA is an independent agency, how independent is it of the executive branch and the president, since it's a part of that?
You know, part of the environmental community has always wanted EPA to be treated like the FCC or the SEC, both of which are genuinely independent enterprises. The president can't pick up the phone and tell FCC to regulate or to permit a radio station or a TV station. And SEC has the same independence. A commission that is appointed by the president, but finally exercises authority according to their statute without involvement by the White House. EPA is not that. The president can direct an EPA administrator to do certain things, not everything, but the reason it is more subject to political control essentially is because it has such a huge reach. I learned when I was being considered for confirmation that I had some stocks that not a lot of, I think I had about $60,000 worth of stocks and board fees that I had accumulated. And there was no way that I could have kept any of them because banking, airlines, automobiles, they're all heavily implicated in the environmental regulatory apparatus. So an EPA administrator has to be free of all of that. Well, as a result, it's considered that, of course, the political leadership, the direction of the country, insofar as we entrust the president to provide it, has to include environmental policy. Now, the president's and EPA administrators and EPA traditions will limit the degree to which the president can involve himself. It has never been seen before that you have had industries wanting to improve their efficiency, lower their pollution, and the White House not permit that, which is essentially what President Trump tried to do with respect to the automobile companies that wanted to follow the California pollution standards. But that's unprecedented, and I don't think, given the experience with it, that we'll see it again.
Well, you touched on the breadth of EPA's authority, and I think that's interesting for viewers to understand. You mentioned the Clean Air Act. There's the Clean Water Act dealing with water pollution. There is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act dealing with hazardous waste and municipal solid waste, Toxic Substances Control Act dealing with the use of chemicals, Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, which deals with pesticide, which is particularly relevant now because they issue emergency use authorizations for disinfectants. Talk a little bit about how broad the scope of EPA's authority is. And in that regard, you might touch on too, there's been a controversy over waters of the United States and how broad that definition is. Uh, how deeply can EPA delve into an individual's personal life and regulate?
Well, the waters of the United States is an interesting issue. Wetlands are extremely important to wildlife, and coastal wetlands are the nursery for most of the fish in the sea. We mangroves, swamps, and the rest. But the definition of the waters of the United States is one that is controversial and arguably difficult to set. I can remember once having produced a manual of jurisdiction for the president and the White House and defending it against the Competitiveness Council chaired by Vice President Quayle. And at some point I was explaining ephemeral wetlands and a whole of the characteristics that go into it. And they're pretty arcane. And he looked over at me and he said, can't we just say when it's wet, it's wet? and that's fair. I once got in trouble with my own staff when I said, look, if it can float a duck, it's a wetland, but if it can't, it isn't. And they said, wait a minute, ephemeral wetlands are only wet a certain part of the year. I am in the Dry Creek Valley in California right now, and it's called Dry Creek because much of the year it is. But it's important when it isn't. It's a source of water and drainage and all of the rest. We have lost about 90% of our wetlands in most states. And that has significantly reduced the wildlife. It has affected the ecology because wetlands are so important, particularly the coastal wetlands, in serving as the first defense against wave action and hurricanes and rising seas. So it's arguably something that's in dispute. It's not an altogether partisan or ideological matter. In some states, they pick up the slack and they do more than the federal government requires. EPA's jurisdiction goes down to, doesn't go down to the 1 acre level, for example. It's substantially more than that in granting a permit. And I think that's long been a contentious issue, partly because it's land use. If you look at the air pollution law, 90% of where you and I spend most of our time is indoors. And EPA does not have authority to regulate indoor air pollution. We could do a lot with respect to it. I made, I think, the most important decision about it when I determined, after 4 years of research and epidemiological analysis and testing and control groups and all the rest, that side stream smoke was a Class A human carcinogen. That had profound consequences. I remember at the time my staff said, let's prescribe the kinds of technology that is best likely to control for this. And I thought about it and I concluded, no, let's simply give the country information. We don't have jurisdiction to regulate. Let's not look like we're trying to control the whole game. And within a year, 400 and some municipalities across the country had passed laws against indoor smoking. And they continue to do that. And I thought back on how that happened. I had no authority other than to give the information, the scientific information to the country. And they did the rest. And I think it was testimony to the degree to which the country trusted science and trusted the Environmental Protection Agency. So that the authority is not always, and my voluntary programs, Green Lights and Energy Star, things like that, they were not compulsory, but a major developer in California said to me, the most effective regulation you ever developed was Energy Star. It's impossible to build any construction of significance in the state of California that cannot promise that it will bear that efficiency standard. And it's not even a law, it's simply accepted in the culture. So much that happens in the environment can be influenced by EPA, and I think of it as the conscience of the country, the green conscience of the country. But it's not all just law.
You raised two really interesting points that I'd like to follow up on. The first is scope of EPA's jurisdiction. We talked about waters of the United States and how extensive that might be. But if you dispose of hazardous waste improperly under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, even though that's on your property, that's subject to regulation. And under Superfund, wherever hazardous substances come to be located, they pose a threat. You can be required to clean them up. So although there may be limitations on the geographic reach of the Clean Water Act, there aren't those same limitations on other programs.
It's very fair. That's very fair. And the interesting thing about the history of hazardous waste is that it was not considered by the scientists, the group I asked when I just took over EPA, tell me, what are the most important threats to the health and ecology of the people of the United States? And to what extent do the priorities of the Environmental Protection Agency, as represented by the budget, reflect that? Well, they concluded that the principal threats were the criteria air pollution, pollutants, and climate change, and coastal seagrasses and mangroves and wetlands and so forth. That hazardous waste was a second order priority from the point of view of influence on mortality and morbidity. And nevertheless, 2/3 of my budget went to hazardous waste. It's an interesting case where the concerns of the people of the United States, which had been very great as a result of findings of waste under schools near Niagara Falls, for example, caused the country to possibly overreact to the hazardous waste issue, to its threat. And the law followed, and my boss, President George H.W. Bush, promised to give vigorous enforcement to the hazardous waste laws. And when I took office, I did that, and I ended up getting more fines and penalties than in the whole 18-year history of the agency. And in industry, as I was told when I went later on the board of DuPont, deciding that, well, with Bush and Riley, that this is serious, we're going to have to do this, and not litigate it to keep from doing it. You know, some great things did come out of it. I remember the chairman of Monsanto telling me that when they analyzed their hazardous emissions coming out of their stacks as a chemical industry, they were astonished to find out how much high-value product they had been sending up as waste. And he then committed to a 90% reduction in those lawful emissions. And I emphasize lawful. These were not at a quantity or level that I could get at. But I did have a voluntary program called 3350 that aimed to get them down by 50%. Later, when there was a recession, he called in a couple of economists who were friends of mine, and he asked them to analyze whether it made sense, because it was costing him money to control to that level. They did their research and asked him, he said, essentially, why did you do this? Why did you make this commitment that went well beyond the law? He said, well, we bet the company on the very best biochemist and scientist coming to live with us, make their career with us in St. Louis, Missouri. And it's what they require. It's what the culture requires. That's how we attract them. And I remember one of the economists told me, he said, we just folded up our book and said, well, you've just answered your own question.
So environmental protection and economic development are not necessarily countervailing considerations. They may go hand in hand, as the example you just mentioned suggests.
Yes, and also at some point, Monsanto resolved several Superfund site conflicts, which had been matters of contentious litigation for some time. And I asked the same chairman, I said, what did you do? You must have done something. And he laughed. He said, I did. He said, I took the issue out of the hands of our lawyers and gave it to the engineers. And it turned out there were solutions, and we implemented them within about 6 months.
Well, I want to return to that point. I'll muse a little bit about hazardous waste and Superfund. To me, it's the hazardous waste regulations are so arcane and difficult to apply. For example, I tell my students, a hazardous solid waste doesn't have to be hazardous, doesn't have to be solid, and it doesn't have to be a waste. And if you start with that premise, then you realize how difficult it is to understand how these regulations apply. But statutes like Superfund are pretty straightforward. If you have hazardous substances that pose a risk, you may need to address them. And that is one area where the Trump administration has been fairly aggressive, because that's something that people can see and feel and sense, as opposed to things like climate change, which are a little bit more difficult perhaps to get your arms around. So the Superfund cleanups have been significant. There have been concerns that in economically disadvantaged communities are more impacted by pollution and by Superfund sites than others. Can you talk a little bit about environmental justice and how that might apply?
One of my proudest achievements at EPA was to create the environmental justice segment or section. We called it environmental equity then. And that really was a response to the discovery that in certain parts of the country, particularly as I recall, Indian reservations, but also in so many other places where there were concentrations of chemical activity, refineries, steel mills, and the rest, the people who were most exposed to the pollution, largely as a result of economics and the kind of property and housing they could afford and could bid for, were minorities and the poor. And it seemed to me that where you had concentrated pollution of an extraordinary level, you should look carefully at why that was and work hard to affect it. I remember once when I discovered that the highest incidence of gastrointestinal illness in the United States was along the Texas-Mexican border, where there are so many colonias that had people living without clean water, with no sanitation. And it should not have surprised us. But we did, in the first North American Free Trade Agreement, allow for $50 million, and Governor Richards matched it, to address that problem. Well, that was essentially an environmental justice investment. Same token, in an Indian reservation I visited, they were getting a huge amount of untreated waste from Albuquerque, in the city. And I gave to the Indian tribes, and then I visited these sites, extraordinary authority. Under the Clean Water Act, I was authorized to do it if I determined that they had the administrative, legal, engineering capability to do it. And I remember sitting with the editorial board of the Albuquerque newspaper, and people upbraiding me and saying, you know, you realize you've given these Indians the possibility of imposing $2 to $3 billion of cost on the city of Albuquerque. And I said, well, look, you've got against their interest, 2 senators and a congressperson. All they've got is me, and but plus the law. And I said, you take a look at the kind of water you're delivering them. They're not going to make you pay $2-3 billion, but they're going to make you clean it up, and it's about time you did. And my biggest defender in that, and I didn't have a lot, frankly. There were not people in the Congress. In fact, the private views that they expressed to me were, some of them, disturbing, about the giving so much power to Indian courts and things of that sort. John McCain. And I had he was ranking on the Indian Affairs Committee. And I remember after spending an hour with him, we went out to meet the press. And I thought it would be perfectly likely that he would do what so many senators feel, or congresspersons feel, that they have to do, which is to say one thing publicly and another privately. I'll tell you later they had to do it. He completely defended me. He said, look, the administrator had these powers. He said he not only had them, he visited the sites. He saw the pollution himself, and he inspected the capacity of the Native Americans to manage this issue. I'm not going to criticize him. I think he did the right thing. So I always had a great deal of affection for John McCain, and he became a good friend on other issues as well. But that was an environmental justice decision, is what that was. And when you look at the Navajo reservation, one of the biggest today, and you see that they are told to wash their hands to cope with COVID. Well, 50% of their households don't have running water. Scandalous that that is true, but it is true. And not a surprise that they have the highest incidence of COVID-19 in the country. If we called each of the major tribal reservations states, they would be the top 5 in terms of incidence per 100,000 population in the country. There's an environmental justice priority of the first order.
So I want to return to a point that you made earlier, because I think it's particularly important for us today. You talked about the role of science and how public education could lead to changes that result in a better environment just by people becoming aware. And I suppose you could say that Rachel Carson's Silent Spring educated people and eventually resulted in the creation of EPA. Talk a little bit, if you would, about the role of science and how do we get people to agree as to what the facts are. There's been some controversy over transparency and EPA's use of independent studies. How do we develop good science? How do we make the public aware of it and accepting of facts?
The American Academy of Arts and Sciences recently surveyed the country, and I was very pleased to see, I'm a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, that the United States population is very respectful of science and of scientists. That is how they respond to polling questions. And that's very important, because if you're administering laws to protect the health of the people, it's such an intimate thing. You have to have their trust. You have to have their confidence. None of us is going to be able to look behind the research on a regular basis to find out whether something that we say is hazardous, say at EPA, is really hazardous, how seriously hazardous it is, whether the cost of regulating it is worth it. Those kinds of questions I posed to the Science Advisory Board at EPA in my first week of tenure. And they did report a statement on risk priorities, as it was called, and both to the ecology and to the health. Well, science is all we have. It's the platform on which consensus can be built. There is no other than just general, I guess, perception of what's right and wrong, but that will differ according to where you are and who you are. I think we have to establish that the science can unify us if we trust it. It doesn't mean that because the scientists have said there's a problem that we have to put a lot of resources into solving it. People may decide it's premature. It's not something we yet want to take on because we have other priorities that are more compelling to us. That's all possible. But we should above all protect the integrity of science, because it is the fundamental unifying platform for decision-making that affects everything else.
We had an example. We were representing first offshore permits in the Gulf of Mexico. They had applied for permits under the Federal Water Pollution Control Act in '72. EPA didn't get around to issuing the permits until about 1980. And there was a lot of controversy. We had environmental groups opposing some of the permits. We represented industry. EPA had another position. And the way we resolved that controversy was to get scientists representing the environmental groups, the NGOs, scientists representing industry in the same room. We said, you all talk about these issues, tell us what you can agree on, tell us what you disagree on, and we'll go from there. And based on that, we were able to settle the case. And I think oftentimes, if we can agree on what the facts are, then we can figure out what our objectives are and the best way to get there. And we've just given some examples.
Well, you know, there's a program at EPA I always loved, Coastal Estuaries Program, during which allowed the administrator to designate 25 different coastal estuaries and provide them extra funds to bring people together to assess the health and the threats to the health of the ecology of the major areas, Narragansett Bay, Corpus Christi Harbor, and Bay. And the extraordinary thing about that was people who did not know one another, or in some cases did not much like or respect one another, came together because they all cared about the bay. And it reminded me of Jacques Cousteau's famous aphorism, people protect what they love. Well, it turns out everybody, environmentalists, polluters, whomever, loves their bay. Chesapeake Bay is the best example around Washington. That will bring people together that, and its protection that would not come together so readily on other matters. And I mention that because I think it's a model, and you just described one, where if you sit together and work hard, this happened in California most recently when the cap and trade program was extended with the support of the oil and gas industry. And the spokesperson for that industry credited Mary Nichols, the head of the California Air Resources Board, for the way in which she consulted, she communicated, she was sensitive to, she listened to the industry and their concerns. So there are ways to regulate that are not in your face, that are not simply take it or leave it, this, I have this power. We need to perfect them in rural America because a great deal of rural America, frankly, has no patience with the Environmental Protection Agency. And they sometimes seem not to be supportive of the environment. Deep polling that Duke University did some years ago, not some years ago, three years ago, I think, 2 years ago, Robert Bonney did the research that showed that they have equal concerns for air and water and a more intimate sense of stewardship of the land than many urban people do because they're close to it and they're depending on the cycles, especially the agricultural community. They didn't want to discuss climate change because they considered it both divisive and that acknowledging its significance possibly invited intrusion into their lives and regulation that would be disruptive to them. But they do get it. We've got to find ways to communicate that are not in your face, are respectful, are acknowledging of the very important economic considerations that sometimes environmental regulations get in the way of. It happens. And the manner in which we do that, I think, can help put the country back together.
I'd like to focus, if I might, on, you've had a number of significant accomplishments while you were administrator. You mentioned the Justice Program, which is particularly relevant today, but also the Clean Air Act Amendment of 1990 had a lot of innovative market-based approaches that really were quite a bit different than the same old, same old. Can you talk about some of those things and how you all came up with them?
Well, the signal pollution problem in the air that George H.W. Bush mentioned in his campaign, was aware of, was a very divisive one. And it was divisive because it affected the regions differently. The Middle West was the source, its power plants primarily, of the acid rain that was disrupting the forest of the Northeast and of Canada, for which it was a major contentious issue, as I was told by Prime Minister Mulroney, dividing the United States and Canada. The acid rain that we were delivering to across their border and affecting their forests and their lakes. Well, that was a hard one to resolve. And the Congress, and particularly Senator George Mitchell, who was a senator from Maine and a majority leader, and was very sensitive to its effects, acid rain's effects on his state and its forest, had been trying to change the law to get acid rain controlled, the sulfur dioxides, particularly from these power plants, reduced. Without luck. over 12 years, this campaign that he conducted and others with him went nowhere. George H.W. Bush, I had actually made a condition of my signing up with President Bush. I look back on it now and I think, well, I had a little huspah as a, whatever I was, 48-year-old. But I gave him 3 conditions under which I would take the job. And one was that he really did mean it when he said he was going to have a new Clean Air Act. And I went through the 3 titles, that acid rain and ground level air pollution and toxic substances. And he said, yes, that's what I promised. That's what I'm going to do. He was as good as his word. And he was very proud of the statute. It's one of the 2 great legislative achievements, along with the legislation for people with disabilities that he pioneered, that he signed. The approach that we took put together the economic interest of the producers of the pollution by saying to them, basically, if you can reduce the level of pollution, and we're going to require that you do so on a scale, and it's a reasonably long time scale. It was over a full 10 years that it was entirely to be implemented. And if you happen to reduce it below the level of the standard we set, which is, I think, 1.2 pounds per million BTUs of sulfur dioxides, you can sell the excess of what you have conserved, of the degree to which you have improved upon the requirement of the law. Well, it turned out that for a lot of the newer plants, and looking at some of the technologies that were available, it was possible to do that. It wasn't possible for all of them. And for those that it wasn't possible or more economically feasible, they could buy permits, so long as the aggregate of pollution from those plants came down. And it had to come down by 10 million tons, very significant reductions. Well, it turned out that we did something also in the law that surprised Congressman Dingell and Senator Byrd of West Virginia, 2 of our major opponents in that law. We got the Western senators and Congress people who had never been enthusiastic about EPA or environmental priorities or protection. We got them to support this law. And the way that we did that was we had a performance standard for coal, essentially, where previously the law had required a 90% reduction in the sulfur dioxides of the coal that was used, which basically made no distinction between whether it was clean coal or West Virginia dirty coal. And that was intentional. That was put there really essentially with the support of Senator Byrd, head of the Appropriations Committee, who was from West Virginia. But we said, no, that what meets the standard without any kind of controls is fine. If you're going to use really clean coal from the Powder River Basin in Utah, say, in the western states, that's sufficient. So it's just performance. It's no longer an artificial or arbitrary statement that you have to transform the content of the coal that you use. That brought a new coalition together, and together with the Northeast and New England and the far West congressional representation, well, finally, everybody came together. We had 2 senators, I think, 2 senators from Illinois, bothered me a lot because I came from Illinois, and maybe 10 or 11, I think something like 87-12 senators voted for the Clean Air Act amendments, and the margin was equally overwhelming in the House. Finally, that legislation brought the country together. And you know, we estimated at EPA that the cost of every ton of reduction of sulfur dioxides under regulation would turn out to be $700 or $800 a ton. The electric utility industry estimated it would be $1,200 to $1,600 a ton. It ended up being less than $200 a ton, largely because of this market-based approach, a creation of new incentives and an emphasis on performance.
It's an incredible idea when you look back and you think about it. You know, we we think about regulation as being command and control, but this was a real innovation to incorporate a market-based program, a regulatory program that allowed industry to bank emissions and trade them, and led to significant reductions in air pollution. And that's formed the basis, hasn't it, for some of these regional greenhouse gas initiatives throughout the country. Correct? The whole notion of banks and emissions trading, correct?
Well, that's right. And it's ironic that the Europeans have at first were very resistant to this kind of approach. And there were some people who insisted on saying, look, you're giving people a permit to pollute. And I remember it would startle them when I said, well, that's the business I'm in. That's what effectively EPA or any permit granting regulator is doing. Only, you know, if it gets above a certain level, we're charging them for it. And it has to come down. That is something that should make the Republicans, who are very, very involved in the evolution of that legislation and supported it generally, most of them, with exceptions for the very high coal-dependent states, which I understand. That's something they should be proud of. And especially the fact that it worked. You know, we ask government to work. Well, here's an instance where it worked. Greg Easterbrook referred to EPA's history a few years ago. He said, along with Social Security, the environment is one of the two great achievements of social policy of the post-World War II era. Well, it's a bipartisan achievement. Right from the beginning, there were Republican senators intimately involved, Stafford and Baker and Chafee, in the evolution of a lot of these priorities and of these laws that reflect them. So we need to remind ourselves that it was not always a partisan and divisive issue, and it needn't be now.
Bill, to wrap up, you've really had varied experiences, and we touched on some, but not others. You head up the World Wildlife Fund, a significant non-governmental organization. You've worked with any number of industries. You've counseled and advised them. In sum, what is the role of corporations? What is the role of NGOs? What is the role of government? And what is the role of individuals to try to further EPA's goal of protecting human health and the environment? How can all these different segments work together?
Well, that's a big question, but you know, NGOs are the drivers. They have the edge of the spear that they thrust. And in my time at EPA and representing the United States with other countries, it was impossible to overlook the fact that in those nations with strong NGO communities, Germany, the Netherlands, they were much more responsive, much more environmentally oriented, much more attuned to listening to environmental claims than those that didn't. Say, that's their role, and they will undoubtedly always push, and as I know very well, never be satisfied. It's often been said that EPA lacks a constituency because the industry is threatened by it and is subject to it and has adversarial relations with it, and the NGOs never think it's doing enough and constantly complain and criticize for that reason. Well, there's truth to that. That's why you have to have a president who understands that that's the game, that's the way it's going to develop. Industry has an extraordinarily important role. In terms of technology development, look at what they did to develop the cars that are as clean as they are today. I look at so many that I've had encounters with or watched perform. Mars investing in new seed and techniques for growing cacao in West Africa. Starbucks helping Central American coffee growers as the climate begins to impact on lower level lower altitude coffee plantations to find new ways of cultivating coffee, new seeds. Coca-Cola in India, developing basically water recycling that means that they're not taking anything from the groundwater, that they're not replenishing. It's full of the stories are legion, DuPont, Unilever, and product controls and protocols. Marvelous story I like too about the modern day consumer importance. Asian paper is a very big producer of paper, and they made a commitment under a lot of pressure and criticism with the World Wildlife Fund not to take from certain areas where they had been knocking down forest in Indonesia. Well, it turned out that World Wildlife Fund did a DNA analysis of toilet paper being sold in Europe. And, this couldn't have happened 10 years ago, and located precisely the source of that wood product. Well, Asian paper fessed up, said that they really were going to have a clean slate and change their policies. And they did. I think that's shorthand for expectations of companies in today's world. And I think sustainability is so important to the recruits they're going to make to populate their professional ranks. And it's what we all want and require. And industry has the capacity to give it to us. Let's face it, most of these gains that I described in the environment were finally private sector victories under federal compulsion. And they've done it, and they can continue to play a very constructive role, and they deserve credit when they do.
And so the individual through the marketplace, among other ways, can significantly affect corporate behavior and help protect the environment. Well, Bill, I can't thank you enough for sharing your insights with us today. It was a remarkable conversation, and I'm privileged to have had it with you. I'd like to thank the folks at EarthX, Trammell Crow, Bruce Fogarty, and McBee, and all the folks at EarthX for making this opportunity available. And we hope you tune in our next show as well. Thank you.
I would just add my own thanks to Trammell Crow and to everybody associated with this program, and particularly to you. It's really a pleasure to be asked these questions by someone so informed and sophisticated, who actually knows the background. And I think I've really enjoyed the last hour.
It's been my pleasure. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you.
And also my privilege. Thank you.
In every town and city across America, people are making a difference for our planet. For 50 years, Earth Day has served as a call to action for the public to get engaged in their environment. And for 50 years, EPA has worked side by side with communities across our great nation to ensure we leave a better, cleaner world for future generations. Join us this Earth Day as we show our love for the land we call home.
Hello, I'm EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeler. For nearly 50 years, EPA has been an integral part of Earth Day celebrations across our great nation. Over the last 50 years, all of our environmental indicators have improved, and they continue to improve. This year, we celebrate half a century of accomplishments, including in 1970, more than 40% of our nation's drinking water systems failed to meet even the most basic health standards. Today, over 92% of community water systems now meet all health-based standards all the time. America also continues to be a leader in clean air progress, reducing the 6 criteria air pollutants by 73% over the last 50 years. In the past 3 years alone, we have moved 38 areas from non-attainment to attainment of the criteria air pollutants. And EPA's successful Superfund and Brownfields programs are bringing opportunity back to communities. Last year alone, we delisted more Superfund sites than any year since 2001. This year, EPA will be observing CDC guidelines as we take our celebrations indoors and online, and we encourage you to do the same. On April 22nd, follow along with the hashtags Earth Day 2020, Earth Day at Home, and EPA at 50 for educational discussions and activities for you and your family. We also invite you to join EPA employees in decorating your windows to mark this important 50th anniversary celebration. Although these are difficult and uncertain times, we can accomplish great things when America works together. Stay home, stay safe, and have a happy Earth Day.